Dave Olson, Normandy. Beautiful question. So today is June 6th. It's the anniversary of D-Day. Yeah. Some people are shocked to know that, I forget the exact number, but I think we had 800 men killed in the rehearsal for D-Day. It's not widely known. It would have been considered catastrophic for morale. But prior to the D-Day invasion, there was a rehearsal and exercise of the D-Day invasion. And it involved bringing guys on shore, as you would think you would probably do. And the naval protection was not up to snuff, and a U-boat got in there and sank a transport or something like that. And 800 men were killed rehearsing for D-Day. It's so interesting being married to a Russian woman, because if you understand, really get down to the brass tacks of history, especially World War II, it's very tough to make an argument that's impressive to Russians because of what they suffered in that war. But and I'm including Stalingrad in this. I cannot think of an example in the Eastern Front that required the same kind of individual courage that the Rangers going up that cliffside had. I can't think of anything in the war, or any war, that matched that. Edward Smith Actual says the Germans didn't guess it was a rehearsal. Yes, they knew it was a rehearsal for the invasion. They knew the invasion was coming, for 2 years. They just didn't know where. And just as a quick aside, I've forgotten the name of the operation, but Hitler was convinced that the landings would occur in Calais, which is the shortest distance. Normandy's significantly further away. It's a significantly longer ride to get to Normandy. And Hitler was convinced that they would land in Calais. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why he didn't respond quickly enough was, first of all, he was sleeping. Nobody wanted to wake him up for fear of, you don't wake up Hitler. So he didn't know about it until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that day, something like that. But Hitler also didn't react quickly enough because he was sure that the Normandy landing was a feint, that the real attack was going to come in Calais. One of the reasons the Germans were so convinced of that was because of an intelligence operation, which I think was run by the British. What they did was they had the body of a British officer who'd been drowned in some kind of an accident or something, but he just died and he was drowned. And they decided that they would, needless to say, they'd had this plan in effect in advance. They're just waiting for the right candidate. The name of this operation I've forgotten, but it was interesting. What they did was, when this officer drowned, they put orders for the invasion into his pocket. And then they, cover of darkness, sailed him out to the French coast, and they threw him into the water at an appropriate tide. And sure enough, this body washed up on the beach. And the fact that the man was dead and had these orders in his pocket, Steve Darrow said he wasn't an officer, he was a bum. Is that right? That's interesting. I thought that may be true, actually. It's a guy that actually rings a bell. That maybe he wasn't an officer. In any event, there was a British person who died, and they dressed him as an officer, and they put these orders in his on his person and let him wash ashore on the French coast. And the Germans were so convinced that there's no way that this could be an accident. That it went a long way to convincing them that it was going to happen in Calais. And furthermore, there was a great deal of work done by a number of different people to convince the Germans that the landing was going to happen in just across the channel in Calais. They had radio chatter for units that didn't exist. Patton was said to command that particular unit that didn't exist. They figured Patton was the best general we had. He probably was. It certainly was the best tank general we had. And they spent a great deal of time, including decoys and things for the German reconnaissance airplanes to see. They had Sherman tanks that were made out of canvas and plywood. And an enormous amount of effort went into convincing the Germans that we were not going to land in Normandy, but rather in Calais. In any event, so D-Day. There's so much about this particular story that's so heartbreaking. I think the thing that to me is the most heartbreaking about D-Day is, and I just mean this out of respect for the people who were there, my understanding, is it Operation Mincemeat? My understanding is that there was extensive film footage of the invasion. Extensive. And that after the film was shot, somebody somewhere opened either one canister or many canisters and ruined the footage of D-Day. That all we have now, all I've ever seen of the actual D-Day invasion is the same clip, 2 or 3 clips. There's one clip of these 4 or 5 guys running and one of them drops. There's another clip with a couple little splashes in the water, but there was also a lot of footage of what actually happened on that beach, and it was lost, and I think that's a tragedy. Dave Wellman says the movie called The Man Who Never Was. That's right. I think that movie was based on him, based on the... that's quite an old movie now, but yeah, based on the on that particular operation. So I guess that is true. They just invented this whole thing in false orders, false ID, false everything. So in any event, but D-Day is it's tough. You know, on some level, having not been there, it seems that the Marines went through a version of D-Day at least 7 or 8 times, I want to say, something like that. When they went ashore on places like Iwo Jima, they did not, they specifically held their fire until the guys got on the shore, so they didn't have the experience of having that gate go down and having the people in front of you just disintegrate. Obviously, the definitive D-Day experience is Saving Private Ryan. And the opening 10 or 15 minutes of that movie are, without question, one of the greatest 5 pieces of cinema ever made. And I remember watching it the first time. And of all the things I remember in that movie, the thing I remember most was right at the very beginning, where they're just getting ready to go, and they're, and then the water is choppy, and some guys are getting sick, and Tom Hanks' hands is shaking, and they get to the beach, and the ramp goes down, and immediately the first 5 or 6 guys just turned into bone fragments, and just mist, and bone fragments. They're just completely shredded and destroyed. And I had thought, needless to say, that I'd see these guys run off the boat, start wading through the water, and then get gunned down. But the idea that they would just be basically just almost, vaporized by this incoming machine gun fire the second the door went down really shocked me in a way that it was supposed to shock me, because it shocked them too. There's a great deal of controversy, not about whether or not, needless to say, about whether or not D-Day helped end the war. There's no question, needless to say, there's no question that it sped up the war, and there's no question that that the advances made by the British and the Americans were hard won and heroic and very, very costly and important. The reason I bring up this as a moment of hesitation is I suspect that if D-Day had never happened, I think the Red Army would eventually have beaten the Germans, but they would have lost a lot more people. Stalin was complaining the whole war, Why aren't the Allies doing more? Well, one thing the Allies weren't doing, Stalin, was making a deal with Hitler like you were, so maybe you ought to be a little more circumspect in your criticism, because while you were basically palling it up with Hitler, Winston Churchill's fighting Hitler all alone. Now that Hitler's invaded the Soviet Union and the peace treaty you had with Nazi Germany, now that that's being violated, now all of a sudden we're the slackers. The Red Army moved from its deepest positions, came all the way back and took enormous losses and fell back. And my wife has a grandfather who was killed in probably the first or second day of the war, right on the border during that initial German assault, which is shocking because you hear about this one, heavy losses. Oh, heavy losses. Yeah. My grandfather-in-law. But there's so much connected here. One of the reasons that the Soviets were able to travel from the Volga to Berlin was because even prior to Hitler invading the Soviet Union, we gave the Russians 100,000 trucks. 100,000 trucks, Studebaker trucks, were provided by the Americans to the Red Army, and virtually all the boots they wore. Significant number of their airplanes, at least early in the war. And the T-34, which was the best tank of the war, I think, was based on at least on a suspension that was designed by Americans, and we didn't use it. We went with something else for the Sherman tank, and the whole thing about the Sherman tank, and, back and forth and back and forth. But here's the thing I think about D-Day. If the Marines had been thrown off the beach, and just the fact that I say if, because it's actually kind of amazing that that they never were. I mean, really, if you get right down to it, given the odds they faced, the Marines were never stopped. They just kept coming ashore. But if the Marines hadn't taken Guadalcanal, or if they hadn't taken, Tinian or Tarawa or Iwo or any of these places, the war in the Pacific would have continued. But if the D-Day invasion had failed, it's hard to see how the war in Europe on the part of the Allies would continue for at least another couple of years. That one had to go. And as big as the D-Day invasion was, the Operation Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese islands was 4 times the size of D-Day, planned to be 4 times the size of D-Day, and D-Day was by far the biggest armada ever assembled. It was just astonishing. Winston Churchill was responsible for a number of key parts of that invasion working, and the 2 of them that I think come to mind are the Project Pluto and the Mayberries. Mulberries. They knew that if they were going to go to Normandy as opposed to Calais, which they would have just mined and blown up, they never would have gotten the port. It would have been nice to get Antwerp, but Antwerp was also basically, they just, sank block ships in the harbors. They couldn't get to Antwerp right away. So they realized if they're going to land on these beaches, we can get a bridgehead in there, but if we're going to get enough supplies off of these things, we need to be able to bring freighters up to these docks. We can't swim everything. We can't swim our supplies ashore. We gotta walk them ashore. We gotta drive them ashore. It was Churchill's idea to have a floating harbor, build a harbor in Britain, and then tow it out there, and then sink the pilings, and create a pier. So the whole Mulberries were pretty much his idea. One of them was destroyed very early, within a couple days in a storm, but the other one basically unloaded millions of tons of supplies. And I think it was also Churchill who had the idea about Operation Pluto, which was the idea of, rather than, because it all comes down to fuel, they say again and again and again, it's always, always, always the same thing. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And Churchill had the idea that this invasion is going to run on gasoline or diesel fuel. It's going to be mechanized, and if we don't have enough fuel, we're going to be stuck on the beachhead and we'll get cut up there. So Churchill had the idea that rather than taking fuel over in ships, they would just basically make a gigantic hose and pipe it over. And that's exactly what they did. Just laid a hose on the bottom of the channel and piped the fuel aboard. Interesting that the one thing that we hadn't considered, the biggest resistance to the Americans after landing on D-Day was not the Panzer divisions that we were worried about, and it wasn't the Wehrmacht, and it wasn't counterattacks by the Luftwaffe. The big unknown in the invasion was the hedgerows. We didn't have any idea that those hedgerows would be as impenetrable as they were. And while the actual invasion went well, by the time we were at D+30, we were 25 or 26 days behind schedule. I mean, we were supposed to be out of Normandy and out of the hedgerow country within a week, and we were there for months. These thick hedges that they used in France as walls, essentially as property walls, were virtually impenetrable. Perfect defensive positions. You basically put everybody in it's almost like an urban setting. And finally, American ingenuity came forward with these Sherman tanks, where they put these things on the front that look like the things you put on hair clippers, and they do the same thing. And basically, just once this like kind of forked thing got into the hedgerow, they could plow them up with the tanks. But until then, it was completely stalled, and we were worried about that. Dave Wellman says his two boys are World War II tank nuts. I cut by my armor opinions. Honestly, yeah, World War II tank nuts. I was one of those as a kid growing up. I built models of everything, everything. I remember those so well. I want to say they were 1/72nd scale, but I'm not sure. But I remember building. I certainly remember building the Shermans, and then you built the various Panzerkampfwagons, the 3s and the 4s that were kind of old-fashioned, and then you had the 4 wasn't a bad tank. Then the Tiger was basically the same kind of thing as the PKWs, and same kind of squared-off frontal armor, huge gun on the Tiger one. And then I especially remember building the Panther and the Tiger too, the King Tiger. Those two tanks were just awesome. They just looked cool. They looked like they were from the future. The Panther and the King Tiger were just sloped armor. They looked like they were from the next war. A lot of what Germany made would look like it was from the next war. The problem with the Panthers and the King Tigers are unbeatably good tanks. They're great tanks. But you didn't make enough of them, and they didn't make enough of them. They had too many mechanical problems, and they came too late. So, but my friend Steve and I used to play with these tanks, and this was before laser tag, and now you can get models that do this. I see it, oh man. But we would just crawl around in the dirt out in back of this house, and you'd be on one side, be on the other, and we'd just kind of pushing our tanks along there. And whenever we see each other, we had lots and lots of tissue paper and straws, and we'd just shoot spitballs, and the first guy to hit the other guy tank was the winner of that. And this craziness. That was a lot of fun. There was another story about this, something about the model making. It's just eluded me. But in any event, so Dave, I know this has been very, meandering, but there's nothing I can say about D-Day that is not better said in Saving Private Ryan. And as I said, I can't think of a example of greater bravery under fire than going ashore on that beach, and especially the Rangers, who had to go ashore under that fire and then scale this gigantic cliff with they're essentially with their bare hands, and shoot some ropes up there. And unbelievable. And I suppose it bears a mention to think just for a moment anyway of some of the Wehrmacht soldiers that were just, they were just guys who were drafted and they're fighting for their country. And it must have been a hell of a thing to wake up one day and look out the slits of that bunker and not be able to see any water because there were so many ships there. It would scare the living daylight out of you. And even though they got a lot of our guys going ashore, that none of those initial positions survive. And in fact, the other thing too, by the way, just bears mentioning, I think briefly about D-Day is we all have this image of D-Day and how horrible it was, and it was horrible. But really, it was mostly just horrible on Omaha Beach. We forget that there were 5 landing beaches and that almost all of the casualties were taken on just one of them. So Omaha and Utah Beach were the American beaches, and Gold, Sword, and Juneau, if I remember correctly, were the 3 beaches that the British went ashore on. And most of those were, I don't want to say it was completely like a cakewalk, but it was nothing like Omaha Beach. And that's something that's not often said.